Let's take a look at the Pugh Clause. The Pugh Clause is a clause in an oil and gas lease, and it's usually an amendment to the oil and gas lease. It's not usually included in the printed body of the lease itself. So it's something that landowners and the oil and gas companies can negotiate. Now, it's called the Pugh Clause, and it's easy to remember because the oil and gas company thinks it stinks. And here's why. The way this works is that if you have an area where there's lots of leases, in the olden days, before we had the pooling provisions, according to the law, according to the terms of your oil and gas lease, if you wanted to maintain each lease, you would have to drill a well in every single lease. And that's why you see that derrick of derrick after wells in those old pictures of initial oil fields. Because you literally had to drill a well for every lease. Then in about the 1930s, states got the idea that if we had less holes in the ground, we would actually be able to generate more reserves if we had one well for a bunch of leases. And this way, everyone would benefit. It doesn't matter if the well is on your lease or not. If you are part of the unit and there is a well that's drilled, it's going to hold your lease and it's going to enable you to get royalty payments even though the well is not on your specific land. So great, so people then began to form these pooled units. And let's say this is an example of a pooled unit here. So we're going to include all of these leases in the pooled unit. The Pugh Clause arises when you have someone that owns a lease, and part of the lease goes outside the boundaries of the unit itself. Even though this part of the lease is not in the unit, that well in that pooled unit is going to hold this part of the landowner's lease as well as this part of the landowner's lease. Now, he's not going to get paid anything for this part of his lease. He's not going to get paid anything because it's not included in the unit. So any royalties generated by this well are not going to be given a share of this lease. So a man named Lawrence Pugh, who is a Louisiana attorney in 1947, said, you know what, this isn't fair. This isn't right. It's not fair for a well over here to hold this lease if there's part of the lease in the unit and part of the lease outside of the unit. This prevents the landowner from getting any revenue from the lease. It prevents him from getting a bonus payment to release the land that's not being used. And so he came up with a clause that basically said, if you have an oil and gas lease and part of the lease is within a pooled unit and part of the lease is outside the pooled unit, you, oil and gas company, have to release this part of the lease that is outside the pooled unit. You have to release it. And that way this landowner can then lease this 40 acres to another oil and gas company. They can get a bonus and they could possibly have a well drilled on that acreage, or that acreage could be pooled into another pooled unit and they would thereby get their revenue interest. That's the gist of the Pugh Clause. If you just remember that if you have a lease, part of it is inside of the unit and part of it outside of the unit, we're going to require the oil and gas company to release the part that's outside the unit to give the landowner the opportunity to lease it to someone else and possibly then have another well on that property or a pooled unit on that property, and then they would be able to get the revenues or the bonus or the royalty payments. Now, the actual wording is, notwithstanding anything to the contrary, it is agreed that should lessee exercise his option to pool or combine any portion of the land covered hereby with other lands, leases, or leases as hereinbefore provided, that is where you combine the leases in a pooled unit, then such operations and production on and in any such pooled unit as herein provided shall continue this lease in force and effect during or after the primary term. So as long as we drill anywhere in this pooled unit, it's going to hold the interest past the primary term. As to that portion or portions of the land covered by this lease included in such unit or units as here and above provided, but not as to such proportion of said lands covered by this lease and not included in any such unit. This lease may be kept in force and effect as to such remainder in any manner elsewhere provided in this lease, not inconsistent with this paragraph. So it says, okay, we're going to let you pool, but if you have some lands that are covered by the lease, but they're not included in the unit, then you're going to have to release those lands. And that is basically the Pugh Clause. Now they also have what's called a depth Pugh Clause, where it says if you drill a well so many feet down, whatever that stratigraphic area is, that stratigraphic equivalent is, you have to release all the depth below that. So some people call this horizontal and vertical. Some people call this vertical, that horizontal. The way I remember it is you either have a surface Pugh, which means you release that part of the surface and minerals that are excluded, or you have a depth Pugh, which means you release all depths below the area that was drilled. And that is the Pugh Clause.